Ma'am, you are live now.
Hello and welcome to our distinguished panelists and those joining us on the YouTube Live. Today we're going to be discussing about how to combat plastic pollution, mainly with a focus on global treaties and if they're the right way moving forward. Every minute, an equivalent of one garbage truck of plastic is dumped into our oceans. A growing environmental concern, the problem of plastic pollution jeopardizes food safety, quality, human health, aquatic life, coastal tourism, and also fuels climate change. This sort of marine trash and pollution not only has these impacts on human health and aquatic life, but also other unintended impacts on the environment. Its impact is certainly global, and hence, to tackle it, a global response is required. However, it's essential to discuss what this response should be and frame it in a way that it operates at complete efficiency in the world today. In this webinar, we aim to address these issues with a specific focus on global treaties and if it is the right way moving forward to combat plastic pollution. So this webinar is being organized by LSAF in collaboration with Law Asia. LSAF, or the Environmental Law and Science and Advocacy Forum, focuses on environmental law and environmental issues through the interface of law and science. They have various focused programs that identify these gaps between the two knowledge goals and science and implement these in the way where they are effective and also have research and policy driven activity. ELSA brings these fields of knowledge together to create cutting-edge collaborations and programs at the law and science interface with the aim of strengthening environmental policy and decision-making. Law Asia, our other collaborator, is a large network of lawyers, judges, and other legal organizations representing Asian Pacific interests and concerns in the legal sense. For over 50 years, Law Asia has operated as a platform to promote cross-jurisdictional exchange of legal knowledge as a voice of legal profession and as a conduit for encouraging adherence to mutually held principles of the rule of law, professional integrity, and protection of human rights. Law Asia has individual, organizational, law firm, and corporate members from over 40 jurisdictions. The Council frequently issues declarations of principles in order to express a consensus of its members' views on issues of law, legal practice, legal profession, and/or the rule of law. From Anchors, we have joining us today Professor Karen Robbenheimer, one of the panelists, and Professor Gregory Rose. From Anchors, which is the Australian National Centre of Ocean Resources and Safety, Dr. Robbenheimer, who joined Anchors in 2017 after getting her PhD in 2016, which focused on international and regional policy frameworks. At the 17th meeting of the United Nations Open-Ended Informal Consultative Process on Oceans and the Law of the Sea, she presented a possible model for an agreement titled Marine Debris, Plastics and Microplastics. She was working with the UNEP to assess the effectiveness of international and regional regulatory frameworks to prevent marine litter and microplastics. She also holds a Master of Environmental Management and has a background in information technology. Also part of Anchors, Professor Gregory Rose. In July 2020, Dr. Gregory Rose took over as the chair of University of Wollongong Academic Senate. From 2015 to 17, he served as the deputy chair of the Senate, and before that was a member of the Senate from 2013 to 14. His area of expertise is in international law relating to maritime affairs, environmental protection, and national security, particularly in the context of the sea. At Anchors, he teaches law of the sea, international fisheries law, and fisheries crime.
Thank you, Didi. The next panelist we have is Professor Abhinav Chaudhary. Dr. Abhinav Chaudhary is a professor and assistant dean of student affairs at Jindal School of Environment and Sustainability. He is also a co-director of LSAF. In many vulnerable regions like the Sundarbans of India, he has been actively involved in conservation and alternative livelihood efforts. He, in fact, earned his PhD from the Indian Institute of Technology, Indian School of Mines, with MHRD Fellowship on the research question, how development and climate change is impacting mangrove ecology at Indian Sundarbans. He contributes book chapters, journal articles, newspapers, and worldwide blogs on environmental concerns on a regular basis. Next, we have Professor Tarini Mehta with us. Dr. Tarini Mehta is an expert in environmental law and human rights advocacy. She is the co-director of LSAF, Assistant Dean and Associate Professor of Environmental Law at the Jindal School of Environment and Sustainability. She holds an LLM from Cambridge University and a doctorate in International Environmental Law, International and Regional Environmental Law, as well as climate change legislation, are some of Dr. Mehta's main research interests. In addition to her academic work, she has also conducted legal and social research for various organizations. Next, we have Professor Judith Weston with us. Dr. Preston serves as a legal officer for the Northern Land Council in Darwin, Northern Territory from 1982 to 1984. She worked with several prominent law firms in Sydney in a variety of commercial law, contract, and personal injury matters after assisting with the establishment of the Environmental Defender's Office, the first public interest environmental legal center in 1984. Since then, she has taught a variety of legal subjects at the Northern Institute of TAF, Institute of Western Sydney College, Macquarie University, and the University of Sydney with a focus on environmental law. The webinar will begin by Dr. Preston delivering the opening remarks, followed by the panel discussion being moderated by Professor Mehta. May I now request Dr. Preston to give the opening remarks.
Thank you very much for that very nice introduction. And I'm going to share my screen now. I'm very pleased to be here in my own right and on behalf of All Asia. So I'm just going to I'm trying to move this. It's not actually working, so I'll go back to this one. Okay, sorry, it's on the side, but the other one doesn't work. So just to reiterate that we're going to talk about the potential of a global treaty as a suite of approaches addressing plastic waste production and disposal in the environment. But before we get underway, I want to acknowledge and thank Indigenous, minority and local communities around the world who work tirelessly and often at great risk to protect the environment through their cultural knowledges and practices at the interface of customary and non-customary law. I extend the greeting to any elders and community members from those groups who are present today. So basically, I want to talk about our addiction to plastic, talk about the impacts of waste, particularly on Indigenous, local and minority communities related to environmental and social injustice, the links between plastic waste and their impacts on Sustainable Development Goals, and look at solutions. I know everyone will be talking about the potential of a global instrument, but there are other initiatives which could support this approach. So some statistics. 2017, world plastic production reached 348 megatons, 20% increase from 2012, and a tenfold increase from 1950. 2021, 30 million tonnes of plastic waste found its way into freshwater and marine ecosystems. Plastic waste production is expected to double again by 2035, and I imagine that's conservative. So the extent of plastic pollution might be shown by an example of microplastics, which have been found in polar ice caps and every ocean basin in the world. Plastic bags in the Marianas Trench in the Pacific Ocean have been found at 11 kilometres below the surface, and that's the deepest place on Earth. Another horrifying plastic waste fact is the aptly named Pacific Trash Vortex, well, I would say waste vortex. It's a collection of waste, and particularly plastic waste, originating from the Pacific Rim, including countries in Asia, North America and South America. In 2021, the UN Environment Programme, named UNEP, produced a very good report entitled Neglected: Environmental Justice, Impacts of Marine Litter, Plastic Pollution. The report notes that plastic pollution disproportionately affects marginalised communities living in close proximity to plastic production and waste sites. The poor and marginalised are amongst the worst impacted by both COVID-19 and environmental harms, such as marine litter and plastic pollution, directly and indirectly threatening the full and effective enjoyment of all human rights, including the right to life, right to water and sanitation, food, health, housing, culture and development. So just discussing how plastic waste impacts sustainable development goals. Life cycle of waste poses challenges for implementing sustainable development goals such as SDG 1 to eliminate poverty. Plastic waste threatens and impacts the livelihoods and health of people who depend on natural and cultural resources, including fisherfolk, hunters, and those in the tourism industries. SDG 12 aims to encourage responsible consumption and production. Some sectors of manufacturing and retailing industry appear to work against solutions by commodifying natural resources for profit, encouraging more plastic consumption, and don't contribute properly to the prevention and solutions of the problem. Here's an example in Bali in Indonesia, where they've had legal, regulatory and economic approaches to the problem. In 2017, the provincial government of Bali passed an emergency declaration dealing with the collection and disposal of 100 tonnes of rubbish from coastal areas per day. Other responses they had included a ban on single-use plastic items in 2018, which aimed to reduce plastic pollution by 70% within the year. The ban was implemented in 2019 along with other countries, including some states of Australia. Also in 2019, the government proposed a $14 tourist tax, and as far as I can work out, that hasn't been implemented yet, but it's obviously a good idea, and maybe $14 is not enough. And here's a picture worth 1,000 words that I would say. So SDG 17 is the goal of creating partnerships to achieve other SDGs. And there may be opportunities to create equitable and fair collaborative partnerships to address the problems that will no doubt be discussed today. One initiative, of course, will be discussed at this webinar, an international instrument that addresses the whole life cycle of plastic products. It's especially important, in my opinion, to hear voices from affected communities, including Indigenous, local, minority communities, in drafting a global instrument and involve them in partnerships in combating the problem. Today we'll talk about the resolution endorsed by 175 states that spearheaded this process towards a draft treaty due to be finalised, I understand, before the end of 2024. As far as I understand, it sets out basic objectives with nation states devising national plans for preventing, reducing and eliminating plastic pollution. This is similar to other environmental global instruments such as the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Framework Convention on Climate Change. It remains to be seen, in my opinion, whether this is the best approach, as it relies on the will of national governments to pass and rigorously implement legislation to prevent, reduce and dispose of plastic waste. Proposed treaty can be supported by other initiatives, including action to combat plastic pollution. Initiatives taken should be done on a local, national, regional and global level and consistently address social justice issues. Professor Elizabeth Kirk, who is a Professor of Global Governance and Ecological Justice at the University of Lincoln in the UK and an acknowledged expert in marine pollution from land-based activities, recommends considering the following proposals. Governing bodies and intergovernmental organisations develop ways of measurement of existing and projected impacts from plastic pollution, adopting robust regulatory and legislative solutions, regulating, restricting the use and import of specific plastic products, which obviously could be extended to exporting, eliminating unnecessary packaging and extending responsibility to producers and retailers of plastic products for the whole life cycle of their products. She also suggested finding alternatives to single-use plastics, developing educational tools and programs, and extending the knowledge base to include a range of scientific and Indigenous scholars to inform treaty negotiators of the full extent of plastic pollution in ecosystems and help identify and design principles for plastic production and their safe disposal. I feel that this webinar will make an important contribution to discussing relevant issues arising from plastic waste, developing practical solutions which should involve all levels of governance, as well as the public in the decision-making and regulatory processes regarding production and disposal of plastic waste. And finally, I'd like to put in a plug for some young Australians who have done the plastic song, and they include some solutions, I might add. So thank you very much for listening to my introductory remarks, and I'd now like to hand back to our hosts.
Thank you for those insightful points, Dr. Weston. Now I may request Dr. Chaudhary to take over for the panel discussion.
Thank you, Mehak. I hope I'm audible. So yes, as Dr. Preston pointed out, plastics are a grave problem. They're ubiquitous. We have plastic bags drifting miles below sea level in the deepest parts of the oceans. And this is threatening life and health of people, of ecosystems. Plastic production and consumption contributes to greenhouse gas emissions. It, of course, devalues marine ecosystems, terrestrial ecosystems. It literally chokes, kills wildlife. So this is a grave concern. Also, in terms of when you're looking at marine pollution, it becomes a concern because of the services that these ecosystems provide and the impacts that has on people's lifestyles and livelihoods and cultures. Particularly in the context of developing countries and coastal communities and so on. So there are a lot of interlinked issues associated with plastic pollution. Professor Abhinav Chaudhary, you're a scientist and an expert in these issues. Can you shed some more light on the scientific impacts of plastic pollution, and particularly at the scale of the plastic pollution that we are facing currently, and what is the scale of the problem as it exists as of now?
Thank you, Professor Mehta. This is a really interesting webinar, first of all, and we really need this webinar right now, this time of phase, because the plastic pollution is something that is very unmanageable. Even talking from a scientific standpoint, I will just enumerate few points why it is so difficult to handle. First of all, in order to understand what problem it does, like in most cases, we have to understand from where it comes from. So generally, plastics are long chain polymers. To put it in a very layman term, it is a very long chain chemical compounds, which is very difficult to break. And that's exactly where the genesis is. They have been created long back with the innovative idea that they can be used a lot of times and they would not get degraded. And that exact property is what is creating a lot of problems now in this day and age, when we can understand that this particular property is also making it very difficult for the plastics to get degraded when it comes into any ecosystem or any environmental conditions. So where it comes from, first point. It comes from the main source from which the plastics are generally prepared are the byproduct that comes from different hydrocarbon fractionation plants, meaning when we take out hydrocarbons and try to refine it to get better and better grades of fuel, in some stages we get some chemicals which is mostly unusable unless they can be turned into some very high linked chain polymers, which is nothing but plastic that we use nowadays, right? So this process is called the cracking process, by which this particular chemical has been prepared, and then it can be turned into plastics. Plastics are supposed to be not biodegradable. That's exactly why plastic has come into the being, and that's exactly what the problem is right now. So as it is a long chain polymer, it is not possible for biota. So what is biodegradability? When something enters into any ecosystem, the biota or the animals and plants and microbes would be supposed to eat that up and break that into small pieces. When it is broken up, it can go again back to the nature. If this happens, things are totally fine. But in case of plastic, it can never happen, because these polymers cannot be by any means broken down by microbes, because it is not a food source for them, and it is not possible for the environmental gradients, different environmental parameters, we call it different natural chemicals that is present in the environment, to break them either. So what happened with plastic? So first of all, it lands up in most of the landfills. If we see the waste management system of developing nations, we can see that huge landfill that comes in the way, and plastics are generally dumped there. And most of the cases, it runs down through our rivers into our marine ecosystem, and there where the problem even gets grave, because marine ecosystem is something which is still an enigma for the scientists and ecologists. Myself, I work on coastal ecosystem, so I can tell many things about marine ecosystem we are still learning. With climate change coming into place, lots of problem happening. Now, when plastics comes into marine ecosystem, again, it cannot be degraded. It cannot be degraded by any biota. So what happens? It stays in that system for a long period of time. So the half-life period of a plastic is very high than compared to any other chemical that generally humans have created over their lifetime. And now the problem that comes up, third point, is that it will be getting degraded into small particles. These small particles, we call them microplastics. Now, if we go into scientific literature right now, we'll see there are a lot of research going on across the world, trying to find out where we can get the microplastics. Until now, the research is mostly limited to this, that where we get them, and we get them everywhere. We get them in the sea, we get them in the fishes. It is bioaccumulated in the fish tissues. It comes into human body. It is an endocrine disruptor, meaning it directly impacts human body. It gets bioaccumulated in human body, so it directly linked with the health hazards. And every of these problems mostly revolve around coastal areas, because coastal areas, we find a lot of population centered in the coastal region. Almost 50 to 60% of the world's population resides near to the coast. So, and most of the important livelihood of these people are fishing. And it is a known fact, scientific fact, almost from 10 years back, that microplastic do get bioaccumulated into fish tissues. It do get bioaccumulated in the crustaceans, in mollusks, in any kind of lobsters we really like to eat in our dinner and lunch plate. It does accumulate heavily in those tissues, and it can come directly into our body. And there is where the problem comes up. And there is now, due to circulation of the ocean, we can see, many of us already know this, there is something called the garbage patch. It is very near to the southern Pacific. The size of that is almost equal to the state of Texas. It's a huge patch there for a long time, very difficult to remove, and most of them are made up of plastic materials. So now the question comes, how to remove plastic from the environment. The property that we have designed long back, the durability, is the same property that is making it very difficult for scientists to actually take it out of the ecosystem. So it has a multifaceted impact in the ecosystem, human health, environment, and a pressing concern mostly. Yes.
Yeah, and as you pointed out, this durability becomes a matter of grave concern also when we consider the scale of the problem of plastics, where some estimates are that the amount of plastic that is dumped could even reach nearing 60 million tons a year. And then this is still a more positive outlook, keeping in mind the various pledges and legal measures that have been put in place by governments. And if you don't have those, if you just have a business as usual scenario, it could go up to 99 million tons, perhaps even more, of uncontrolled plastic waste ending up in the environment by 2030. That's some of the statistics that are out there. And this is a problem then when you further consider that the majority of plastics are not recyclable, that plastics, because of their very nature, therefore don't fit into a circular economy sort of system. Product design therefore becomes something to consider. So in that sense, plastic pollution is a problem that is comparable to climate change. And the way in which the global community is going to respond to this is going to be extremely important to look at over the coming decades. And this parallel between climate change and plastic waste is also interesting in the sense that they're both these products, plastic and the climate change is rooted in oil. So oil and the oil and gas industry, therefore, has a role to play in both these, serious global issues. Of course, plastic's persistence makes it something which sort of adds this dimension, further concern to plastic pollution. Professor Chaudhary, can you sort of give our audience a brief overview of this production history and the patterns and the role of oil and the oil and gas industry in plastic production?
Yes, I can give a small idea how it has happened. So In the 19th century, we can see that over the period of time in the history, hydrocarbons are playing a very important role. So previously it was coal. Then in 19th and 20th century, it was get replaced by natural gas and petroleum. Now, natural gas and petroleum, mostly petroleum that we get from the geological crust, different sedimentary rock system, these oils are very crude. It cannot be used. The car that is run by the petrol is not this particular oil that we get. It needs to be refined. So when we refine it in different ways, there is a process called cracking, through which there are some chemicals that comes up, which we do not use to run our cars definitely, but those chemicals are there. So the question comes up, how to use them. The main idea of any industry is to get profit, and that is not wrong if we look into from an industrial perspective. What is wrong is, long time back, when scientists started to figure out what to do with this chemical that apparently has nothing to do with the usable product, what can be done with it? And then comes bingo, the plastics. We need something to transport. We think something that is durable. Previously, when plastics were not there are different biodegradable products that has been used, like for example jute bags, which is one of the very good alternatives that used to be there. But when plastic come into being, we can see that this is a very cheap product. First of all, it can be manufactured very cheaply without much investment, because we are getting this chemical automatically in a refinery system. So now this chemical needs to be put together, make into long chain polymers, and one of the greatest source of this chemical is obviously the energy product, hydrocarbons. Due to the fracking and the cracking process only, these chemicals comes up. And when plastic started to flood the market, we see plastic everywhere once upon a time. Just 50 years back, if I look into history, they're coming everywhere. Like even the food plates that we are using to eat our food, to the small transportation bag that we carry, all are made of plastics. And because of the long chain polymers that they inherently get, because they are coming from the hydrocarbon chemicals from where they are prepared, it is difficult for them to degrade. So now I can take this plastic up and don't have to worry that it will get soiled, the food product is going to drop off. Now it started replacing every other transportation processes, like jute bags, like different other bamboo transportation methods that used to be there in China once upon a time, all going to get replaced by plastic. So if I ask a question, who actually get benefited from plastic production? Somehow down the line, obviously the oil and gas companies, because they are the one refineries from which this product is coming up. The precursor product from which the plastic can be prepared is those products that comes up from this. So now when we look into different systems, like how plastic can be removed, this particular property itself is coming in a big problem. So generally how scientists deal with this stuff, whenever we see there is some problem, we try to find some signature organism that eat that up as a food. But in case of plastic, it is very difficult to do, because long chain polymers, microbes don't want to eat it up. If it is not a food, it will not get degraded, because nature don't recognize that element. We call it contaminant. It is not a pollutant per se, it is a contaminant, something made by us, not naturally present. So natural system do not know how to get rid of it. So now we are getting huge tons of this plastic in our oceans, in our landfills, in our systems, everywhere. And who is going to benefit out of it? Definitely the energy companies, because they are producing the main precursor chemical for production of plastic. Yes.
Yeah. So again, this is a problem that is as serious as climate change, and it's about time that world leaders and governments take note of this and take steps. And this international treaty that is now being drafted is a sign that there's a realization that concrete steps need to be taken. And there is now a negotiative committee that has been set up to draft this treaty and so on. Dr. Oppenheimer, you've been working on this drafting process, and you've been working with UNEP. Can you give us a sort of a brief overview of what's actually happening with the treaty as of now?
Thank you. Yes, I guess we're all aware that we've got the mandate to go ahead now and develop a new global agreement. The first meeting was held in Dakar at the end of May. That was a procedural meeting, so it was really to work out the rules of procedure for the upcoming negotiating meetings. So it wasn't a negotiating meeting, just a rules of procedure, very much based on the rules of procedure for the Minamata Convention. Out of that meeting, besides the rules of procedure, was also a list of documents that were requested for the first International Negotiating Committee meeting, which is in November. So there's information that's been requested in preparation for that first meeting. A lot of it was around sort of a glossary of terms, some of the state of the science at the moment, including material flows, the types of pollution, which could lead us towards sort of control measures for the new agreement, and just various aspects of the state of play at the moment. So these are all to try and help inform discussions at the first meeting. There were some hints of what might be discussed at the first meeting, including the objectives and the scope of the agreement. But it's still very much open for discussion. They're trying to work out some clusters that can be discussed. So groupings of themes, I guess. Whether we can actually map those out over the 5 meetings that will be had before the end of 2024 remains to be seen. But there's definitely going to be some articles in the agreement that will be fairly standard, that can be possibly drafted quite quickly. But this agreement, as per the resolution, needs to tackle design and the full life cycle of plastics. And I don't think we've ever seen an agreement at the global level that tackles design. There's still not many ideas out there on how this will be addressed in the agreement. So I think there's going to be some areas of discussion that are going to be very difficult at the INCs, and hopefully we can provide some room for that. I guess when it comes to the objective of the agreement, the resolution adopted talks about plastic pollution. It doesn't define what plastic pollution is or give a scope of plastic pollution. So there's a lot of room for discussion there, including what the life cycle is. We don't really have a full agreement on the life cycle of plastics, and there's a number of options for that. It could be upstream, midstream, downstream. It could be from extraction to production of chemicals and polymers, manufacture of products, consumption, waste management, final treatment, and then also legacy residual plastics that are removed from the environment. So there's still a lot to determine and be agreed upon. We only have 5 meetings and then a final DIPCON in 2025, early 2025, to adopt the agreement. So I think there's a lot of very difficult discussions coming out, and I think everyone's starting to realize the magnitude and complexity of this. As you say, it's as complex as climate change, because plastics are in every component of our life, as is energy. But we will be looking at design for the very first time, I think, at the global level.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. So life cycle approach is something which I ask you to expand a bit more about how the treaty is. How do you think what direction it's going to take? But also, you said a lot of difficult discussions. There's going to be differing opinions. Developing states, developing countries also have their own needs and their own opinions. If you look at the different resolutions that have come out, India, for instance, focus more on single-use plastic. So an agreement which have
think there seems to be a dropout. I'm not sure if everybody's
Yeah,
experiencing it.
I'm not hearing much from Chaudhary.
Must be an internet issue.
Well, perhaps I could step in and make a couple of comments and ask a couple of questions just to fill that gap. I mean, we've referred to the persistence of plastics. Dr. Abhinav was making that comment, which is somewhat similar to pesticides, which are designed to last in the environment and to be persistent. So you have a comparable artificial kind of chemical chain that's designed to persist in the environment. In the one hand, for pesticides, they're designed to poison undesirable weeds or pests. And in the case of plastics, it's a non-interactive, but ultimately endocrine disrupting, and we don't know what other kinds of negative impacts apart from, of course, strangling or choking for creatures that ingest it. And the comparison has also been made to climate change because of the pervasiveness of plastics and the wicked complexity of the problem. So those two qualities of persistence and pervasiveness have been dealt with in international environmental law contexts in the past in dealing with chemicals and persistent organic pollutants. And also in the case of climate change, where the difficult challenge of trying to direct systemic change in the fundamentals of the industrial production process are being confronted. So in a sense, there are comparisons and parallels there with those existing frameworks for chemicals and for climate change, from which a plastic pollution prevention regime might draw. So just wanted to make that analogy and those connections. I'll hand back to Dr. Chaudhary to continue.
Yeah, sorry about that. My internet seems to be misbehaving. So yeah, my question, I don't know, I think Dr. Oppenheimer didn't hear, and thank you, Dr. Rose, for stepping in there. So basically on the point that you had mentioned about these differing opinions and difficult conversations in the drafting of the treaty, the main sort of query that I had was how are, for instance, developing countries, their views, differing views. If you look at the different resolutions, India's floated one which focuses more on single-use plastics. So with all these differing views, could we end up with a sort of a weak treaty, and not actually have a treaty which has all the necessary elements required to phase out plastic? And how are all these different views going to be taken into the drafting process? Karen, since you've been working on this.
Yes, thanks. So I guess firstly, the objective is not to necessarily phase out plastics. We recognize that there's very useful plastics out there, but we just need to manage them appropriately. So looking at the different views that countries have, there is quite a vast difference there. We have some countries that are very focused on controlling the chemicals that go into plastics. So they're coming from a very upstream manufacturing and production phase of the life cycle. Whereas there's others that are focused more on the waste management component and just preventing that waste from landing up on their beaches and in their environment, who are perhaps a little less ready to tackle the design side of it. So I think there's a big differences there. There's some countries who are more interested in just the waste component so that they can keep putting the plastics onto the market. So I think there's going to be quite difficult discussions around what we can phase out, whether we can actually get to a cap on virgin plastics. I'm not sure that that's going to be achievable in the time frame that we have. We've only got 2.5 years to negotiate a very comprehensive and wide-ranging agreement. whereas the Minamata only focused on mercury, and that took nearly 10 years. So we've got a fraction of that time to do a lot more, I think. So yes, I think one of the things we will need to find out is whether this is going to be a framework agreement, or whether we can actually get some details in there. It's more than likely with the timeframe going to be a framework agreement that perhaps just has the language to allow for further development of annexes and protocols after the adoption of the framework agreement. I hope that answered your question.
And that's also one of the sort of concerns of a lot of people out there, that, are we just, there's already so many treaties in place. So do we even need a plastics treaty? What is it going to add? How is it going to complement what's already in place?
Yeah. Well, I keep saying, if we're going to tackle this as a product in the global agreement, you're really looking at improving your waste management, and then we may as well have had a protocol under the Basel Convention. If the real value add of this agreement is to tackle it as a material and at the design phase. So if we don't tackle it at that, I think it's a wasted opportunity.
Yeah. Dr. Preston, you raised your hand.
I did. I just wanted to ask what the propensity for, we're trying to work out another global treaty. Because we've got so many and some of them don't work, and some countries that sign up don't implement them. But one of the values can be that, global north, if you like, countries can support global south countries in terms of funding, technology, problem solving. I just wonder if anybody's got any comments, because I'm not across the detail of the proposal. So in terms of what sort of support you might get, like if you use the World Heritage Convention for a model, there's lots of funding and technology support, and then they've got a body that steps in, like we've seen with the Great Barrier Reef when we misbehave in terms of looking after our global assets. So if anybody's got any comment on that.
Make a comment, which is there's often a surprise in the box that we don't expect. So when it came to the climate change negotiations, it was a big process launched, I think, 1989, 1990, that produced the treaty in 1992. On the other hand, the Convention on Biological Diversity was negotiated in less than 12 months with substantial NGO input just by UNEP rather than under a UN mandate. And the Biodiversity Convention is very general. It lacks much in the way of specific prescription and obligations. And yet it might be argued that it's the more successful treaty because there tends to be more that's done under it to implement it. Although, of course, climate change is perhaps a more difficult problem, but that's arguable. So it's what's done under the regime rather than the specific prescriptions that might well be disregarded that are set out in the text. What those specific prescriptions do is they provide a stick for NGOs to beat the government with when it comes to compliance, but a lot of governments can take a lot of beating and still be insensitive, and NGOs not necessarily that powerful with the stick. So I share your skepticism in relation to the plethora of multilateral environmental agreements and their varying performance. And I think that maybe the bottom line is that they provide an educative function, just as international law lacks an enforcement authority in the classic sense of the rule of law. It sets out norms that become moral measures or rules that change the mindset that ultimately influences behavior in various indirect and nefarious ways that are difficult to track and prove have causative effect, but provide at least a starting point. So it's a modest achievement and a modest approach to the rule of international law in multilateral environment agreements. But there seems to be, in the case of a global plastics regime, an extraordinary global will to draw up a new agreement. I mean, Karen, you must have been pretty shocked when there was such clear consensus on the treaty at the UN Environment Assembly second sitting earlier this year. What was your impression of the global will to take action on this issue?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. I thought the resolution that was adopted was really good. It's really strong. It's quite comprehensive. Paragraphs 3 and 4 give us a good idea of what needs to be included in the agreement. So yes, I was quite surprised that we actually managed to get that over the line in such detail and such comprehensiveness. There were a few things there which did come out in the negotiations that were removed, such as the chemicals. Human health was moved up into the preamble. So there's a few things there which might limit the scope of it. But I think overall it was a really good discussion, and I think the outcomes were really good too. The resolution is strong, and it's a good starting point for negotiations.
Yeah, and as you saying, it's a good starting point with various key issues which need to be fleshed out. One of them being, of course, how we're going to deal with the production of virgin plastic. What is the criteria for sustainable production? That's something which needs to be sort of deciphered more clearly. The life cycle approach, what will that actually mean? What should that actually mean? Professor Chaudhary is a scientist. How do you think a life cycle approach needs to be adopted in such an international agreement? What should be the way forward, according to you as a scientist?
No, okay, a very interesting question. Though I'm not that much aligned with different treaty system, but one thing I would add up here, being a scientist, that first of all, I think the scientific representation in any of this treaty is very important, because sometimes when we talk about like how to phase out plastic, as Dr. Rose just mentioned, that when pesticides and persistent pollutant also has similar kind of problem, like they're persistent, they will stay in environment for a long period of time. Now people are get used to them. So now when we will tell them that, okay, let's phase out plastic because it is bad for the society and the environment, and let's go for the alternative. First of all, this alternative need to be there. Next is how to compel the society to actually leave the plastic and go for a better solution. So this thing transcends the boundary of different disciplines. We need to understand also the consumer dynamics, whether they want to take it or not. How to make it less profitable to produce. Now, that's an interesting point. I mean, if I look back and try to compare it with the climate change model that has been adopted in different parts of the world, like carbon credits, a particular industry which is producing more carbon also has to pay more in order to manage that issue up. So now, in case of plastic, that may be a very interesting process, that whichever industry is more dependent on plastic, they have to give more money in order to manage the situation, because the situation is as present both from a technological standpoint and scientific innovation. It is very unmanageable. The huge amount of plastic that is now at oceans, everybody know where it is, everybody knows that it is going to impact different ecosystems and everywhere, but it is very difficult to get rid of it and change the habit of people. We are now, to be honest, very much okay with the plastic, using it in daily life. How to phase it out, how to get new innovation or new alternative to plastic. That brings us to the question number one, that is, the scientific community, technologists need to produce a very better alternative. One of the example is the PKD, obviously, which is now coming up, which is a polyamine derivatives of plastic that may have a little lesser environmental impact than plastic, but it still has. Now, different other alternative need to come out, and when this alternative we are talking about, it also requires a lot of funding for the scientists to actually work on in order to produce this new alternative, and this is not done overnight. Plastic was not discovered overnight, so definitely how to phase it out, it also is very difficult to do it overnight. It will require time, innovation, something new, cheaper, better for environment, sustainable should come out. For that, the funding need to be there. So I, as a scientist, think that also in these treaties, some kind of funding opportunity for the scientists should be there who are trying to work for an alternative to plastics. because the plastic industry already been funded. They are rich. They are funded by the energy giants. But the one who is working to phase this out, they may not be that much fund rich. So in that case, those funding should be there, as other panelists also mentioned, that how the global north can help the global south. Same problem I would also pose out. Many of the communities who are impacted by plastic pollution are actually from low and middle income nations, and they how they are going to deal with it. Though that would be another question. I mean, many of these nations do not have a proper waste management system to start with. Now we are talking that they need to phase out entirely a very cheap product for them, that is plastic. So what alternative should come up? So science and law and definitely other discipline should work together to build out a model where it can be phased out from different processes. And here the LCA really works, because LCA actually give us an idea that how a product will end up, how it began, how it's going to end up too. And this end up should be always recycling if we want to go for a sustainable kind of circular economy pattern. So many of the plastic used today do not follow that model, because this plastic cannot be reused, and sometimes the recycling processes are very shaky. They don't work that well in a country that is dependent heavily on plastic goods. So something in the treaty should be there that should give an opportunity for scientists to produce a new innovative product that can phase out plastic in one sense, in one direction, in another direction. How to clean the environment, that also requires some scientific innovation and obviously some funding in order to find out which would be the best method for the plastic which is already in the oceans and already in our environment. And on the other way around, we also need to find out from a different perspective how the low and middle income nations can be encouraged to also follow this. That would be my take on it.
Yeah, so again, difficult conversations. Dr. Rose, Dr. Oppenheimer, do you see the discussion sort of moving in that direction in the way in which the treaty negotiations and discussions are going on as of now?
I might jump in there. At the meeting in Dakar, there was a lot of mention of common but differentiated responsibility. We've also started introducing the concept of sustainability criteria, which could be regarded as design criteria. So not standards, which would really be prescriptive on the type of materials and procedures you can, or processes you can use to manufacture, but more criteria around performance and transparency. I think transparency was a concept that came up a lot, the requirement for more transparency across the value chain around the types of materials that are in the products and their recyclability, etc. So I think sustainability criteria can be broken into two categories: the performance and the transparency. And then under performance, so these are the outcomes that the product must sort of adhere to. You've got your environmental performance as well as your safety. So, you know, environmental would cover a lot of things, from extraction from the natural environment right the way through to how it behaves, whether there's emissions of microplastics through abrasion, etc., and then also how it behaves at the end of life. But safety kind of links a bit to the transparency, but the safety is around the chemical exposure of the workers across the value chain, but then also once it's recycled. And the Stockholm has some mention of that, where you can't recycle or reuse products that have these POPs in them. So we can learn from that and bring some of that into the new agreement, where if we're going to go for a circular economy, you know, we need to shrink that economy, we need to slow it down, and we need to clean it up. So the materials coming into the economy are safe to recycle. And I think that's where the sustainability criteria are starting to get a bit of traction. It's one of the only ways I see how we can tackle design in this agreement. And so we're continuing work on that to see how this can help with the agreement to not only push up into the chemicals regime upstream, but also assist in the outcomes for the waste management component downstream.
And I think also one of the things which this treaty, in order for it to actually be effective, that is going to have to deal with is the fact that there are already many legal measures and initiatives in place at the national level, at regional levels. So there also has to be harmonization there, plus the important gap as of now in terms of agreed upon definitions, where you have, for instance, a lot of the definitions and terminology used by the industry itself. So, for instance, reusability, recyclability, whether something is sustainable itself. These definitions, whether it's biodegradable, often these tend to be misleading. And one of the reasons also we don't have third-party verification, there's lack of third-party verification. So there needs to be sort of a moving forward from these kinds of malleable, loose definitions, which will also safeguard against greenwashing. So this is, again, another sort of focus which needs to be there in order to make the treaty effective. And as you were pointing out, we might end up with a framework agreement. We might have protocols coming out after the framing of this agreement. So we may, again, end up with something which won't tackle these key issues. Or do you think that even if you're moving towards a framework agreement, sort of a design of the treaty, there's going to be these key gaps are going to get tackled in the definitions and in the drafting of the treaty?
Right. Well, the starting point there, I think, is some of the documents that have been requested for INC1, which is the first meeting in November, and that was a glossary of key terms. And there's a lot to borrow from there. The Basel Convention has a glossary of key terms, which deals with a lot of the recycling definitions, etc., and the linkages between the terms. So that's quite comprehensive. So a lot of these will be drawn on as a starting point for definitions, if you want to call that, in the agreement. But there, as I say, I think all that leads us to what the scope is going to be and the scope of plastic pollution. Which I think is one of the key areas. But yes, the definitions are going to be very important, so we don't get sort of false solutions coming through. And then, allowing countries that flexibility in how they implement, that has been requested, the flexibility in the action plans, etc. So I guess, with other agreements, we've tried to harmonize these action plans after the fact, sort of retrofit them almost, so that we can get some level of aggregated information that we can then use to track global progress. And I think if we give complete flexibility, as in the Paris Agreement and the CBD, we're going to end up with the same problem here, where we can't really compare action plans. So we're looking at ways of how to do that. Is that based on some sort of headline indicators that each country must report to and then put into their action plan how they're achieving that? That could be one way of trying to harmonize and at least provide us with some information we can aggregate. But I think there's still a lot to discuss in this.
There's a long way to go still. And as you mentioned, tracking progress, so reporting compliance is going to become important. And when you consider that as of now, only about 40% of countries actually publicly report even their waste data. And then, that's going to be something to deal with, of course, how we're going to make sure that countries actually comply with the agreement, with the treaty, however it is formed. Dr. Rose, can you sort of share some thoughts on this? How do we make this treaty more effective and strengthen the reporting and compliance through this treaty? Or will it be able to do it, or will it just not be able to do it at the end?
Thank you for the difficult question. I was very excited at the strong compliance mechanism that emerged in the Framework Convention on Climate Change. But ultimately, there was so much pushback against that, where there was a possible threat of penalties. That was really a new threshold that in multilateral environment agreements, that there would not just be assistance and facilitation and reporting, but there may also be penalties, that there was a lot of pushback. And in fact, compliance mechanisms have never recovered from that overreach. So the high watermark really then is still reporting, meaningful reporting that's harmonized. And in the case of both climate change and biodiversity, but also in other multilateral environmental agreements, there's usually assistance for developing countries to prepare national plans, but also reports, particularly baseline reports. And so that kind of assistance, if it's provided on the basis of conditions concerning conformity or harmonization to in the use of data terminology and so on, that could foster greater harmonization and make it possible to compare like with like, assuming that there is a sufficient coherence of views amongst donor countries, who would be predominantly the 27 EU members and North American or the European and others group of the UN bloc. So that would be one way of fostering reporting and improved compliance, to provide assistance for it on the presumption that those countries that are supporting it will report themselves anyway. I have a question actually that I'd like to put to Dr. Abhinav, and I apologize for the question because it reveals quite a bit of ignorance, but in the petrochemical industry, there's a certain fraction of the oil production that goes into fuel, and then you're saying that the other part that's not usable as fuel forms the feedstock for plastics. So perhaps I can make this into two questions. The first is, do you think that plastics will ever be reduced in circulation if the actual feedstock isn't reduced? Because there is a need to make commercial use of that fraction of production that goes into feedstock. What else can be done with it? So that's the first question. And the second relates to the design criteria that Dr. Rabenheimer was referring to. And I was wondering what your very general preliminary thoughts might be on how the oil industry might, through perhaps scientific and technical groups that are industry and government collaborations or consortia under this treaty, develop design criteria that might improve the transparency of production and the reusability of products and the various positive outcomes that one might want to build into the plastics life cycle through design criteria under this proposed treaty. So two questions. One is the feedstock and the other is the design criteria. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Rose. The very interesting question indeed. The first question I will address. So the first question is like, what about the feedstock? I totally agree with you. As one of the main precursor chemical, I mean, whatever chemical, even in the case of pesticides also, or any kind of chemical that is made by humans, there should be some precursor chemical from where that particular process takes part. So the precursor chemicals come generally from the hydrocarbon industries, from different refineries, the part of the chemical that is generally used only to create polymers. So if some alternative use is there, definitely something better can be done with those chemicals, but those are, we have to understand, these chemicals are not directly the one that is going to give the profit to the company, not the gasoline or the petroleum or the diesel part. These are the part of chemicals of during the refining process that is not going to be used for any, generally not used for any other thing. So plastics, polymerizing them, it is a polymerization process that goes on that polymerize these chemicals into a long sheets of particular chemical, and we call them in a layman term plastics. So these plastics, if the precursor chemical is not there, definitely the production of plastic will get costlier. Now, how it will happen? As it is coming while production of the main fuel that is required. If say the world, in a scenario world is going towards renewables, then definitely the use of these fuels would also get down in amount, maybe 50 years down the line, or if we follow COP26, maybe by 2070 or 2030. So when the carbon emissions will be taken into account, renewable energies will come up, definitely these chemicals will also not be produced, because main idea of production is to produce that particular costly fuel, that fuel their main industry. This is a byproduct. So then something alternative can come up. And that links us to the second question. What would be the design method? So we have to also understand that not all plastics are actually not recyclable. Some plastics, life cycle history is like that, it can be recycled back. But sadly, the most plastic that lands up into our different environmental spaces, be it a marine ecosystem, be it a landfill, be it soil, these are the part of the plastic that is very difficult to recycle, because without a particular kind of characteristics, some plastic cannot be recycled back. And these are the single-use plastics we are talking about. So many countries are taking, I'm not very aware of it, but I am pretty sure I've read that many countries are trying different steps to ban this single-use plastics. So if we, as of now, the first step would be like to make plastic that can be recycled back instead of landing up into the ocean system. But that also gives us to another problem, how to take this plastic from the market to the recycle system. Right. So that's also another very big problem. Like I can give a very fair amount of example. When I go to some of the cities, I see people just throwing the plastic away. It may not be a very common practice in some part of the globe, but in some part of the globe it is. So these plastics is unaccountable. Now the logic goes like, whenever we create a model, like what needs to happen with this particular product, it needs to come back to the particular system where it can be recycled back. If it is getting lost in the process, then this become an unaccountable product, which can land up in different landfills or in many systems. So nothing good is going to be done on that. So, and another point I will also add, now the innovation is in the process of many biodegradable plastics. So whenever we talk about biodegradable plastic, mainly the consumers are not very very receptive of, because if the plastic is biodegradable, it is not going to be used, right, for a long period of time. But there are plastic products coming up that may stay in the circulation for some time, and after some time it will lose its usability and it can degrade up. That also is one of the innovations that's coming. So changing the structure of the plastic and how it can be reused, recycled should be the first step forward. And definitely the energy industry is going to shift towards renewable. The main feedstock chemical to make the plastic cheaper would not be there. So may not, with this, everything comes together, then the feedstock chemical may not be cheaply available and plastic may not be cheap. One of the main reasons why plastic is very difficult to phase out, it is very cheap. If it is not cheap, it becomes competitive in market, definitely other products can come into use. So these are my ideas in a very generalistic term, what can be done.
Thank you.
Yeah, so as Professor Chaudhary's points and Dr. Robbenheimer's, Dr. Rose, what this entire process, the good thing is it's right at the start. So there's we can bring more scientists on board in the actual consultations. That would be one way of taking things forward. We can learn from previous treaties and from mistakes that have been done in the past. There has to be a focus on harmonizing with the laws that are already in place, measures that are already in place, because there's already a lot of initiatives in place. So unless this complements that, unless this does something further, plus actually, I mean, a lot is expected from this treaty. It's to be truly effective, there has to be a large-scale systems change at a international level. So that's why, on the one hand, you're wanting to bring, as many countries as possible on board, but on the other hand, you don't want to end up with a weak treaty, with the lowest common denominator. So somehow that balance has to be struck by those who are drafting this treaty, who are in the negotiating committee. So that's quite an uphill battle. But also my concern, and I think a lot of people out there, is that without this kind of a focus and this kind of work, then we'll just end up with one more environmental treaty, which will just, not be implemented properly. And then there'll be, lots of conferences and conference of parties and reports, etc. But ultimately, you're not going to be able to tackle the problem of plastic pollution in the same way as we're facing with climate change. So we have to do something different when it comes to this treaty and move forward in a different way. So on the one hand, of course, there is global support for the treaty, but whether that support is actually enough to lead to concrete measures, targeted measures, whether the different and developed country, developing country needs are also going to factor in this, whether that would be taken into account effectively. Something still kind of moving towards the audience questions round, but we have some more time. So I'll ask each of the panelists, maybe 5 minutes or so, what would be your thoughts on this? First of all, is such a treaty needed? If it's needed, what should it look like? So if you had the power, let's say, to draft your ideal treaty, what should it look like? What should be the process, and what should be the way forward to make this actually effective? Dr. Oppenheimer and Dr. Rose and Professor Chaudhary.
I might throw in my 2 cents or 5 cents, depending on inflation. First. So the hydrocarbon industry that Dr. Abhinav is describing is a global industry, and plastic is a product in global circulation, both in its distribution as a product after the point of manufacture, but also afterwards as a waste product in the natural environment, coming out through river systems into the oceans and so on. So it's a global problem. And that suggests that it's better to have a global approach than regional or fragmented national approaches. So in favor of a global treaty, I would say that's an appropriate way to deal with a global problem. I would hope that the negotiations don't produce anything too specific and technical, because I suspect that there's a long way to go in developing understanding about best measures forward. But what needs to be put in place is a process that's going to develop appropriate technical measures. They're not going to get them all right in 18 months. There's too short a time frame. So under treaties like the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer, you have the technical panel that industry participates in that is constantly looking at alternatives to ozone depleting substances, even though those alternatives tend to be pretty bad greenhouse gas products. So there is a need for that ongoing development, I think. So it has to be a framework to some degree, and not the final and sealed product. And then it's going to necessarily involve national implementation through action plans, and those action plans you would hope would have a global accountability and transparency, so that there would be an international secretariat that's the repository for national action plans, and that there's regular reporting on implementation on national action plans, and a facilitative mechanism that advises countries on where their action plans might be improved through a cyclical review process, such as occurs in human rights and elsewhere, as a compliance mechanism which is more facilitative of implementation rather than punitive and hierarchical. So just with those comments, then I would say that a global framework is appropriate. It should be one that is facilitative. The technical standards it introduces would hopefully be processes for the development of more technical standards over time, so that we have flexibility and there'll be an evolving and gradually more sophisticated system of indicators and a harmonization across standards for transparency of products and such like. So that's my best guess and hope. Thanks, Dr. Tarini.
Dr. Oppenheimer.
Well, that was a pretty comprehensive overview that Greg gave. So I'll try and build on that. I think the important there, or point there that Greg raised, is that this agreement needs to be future-proofed. You know, we're dealing with an industry that's highly innovative, and if we can't keep up with it, with this agreement, we're going to lose it very quickly. So we need to, as mentioned, have a way of keeping it up to date. I think there's models under the Montreal Protocol, as mentioned, that are useful there, where we have strong engagement with industry. There's also mechanisms to keep track of, you know, what the impact is, what the alternates materials impacts could be as well. So I think we need to find a way to future-proof this agreement. We've got examples under some agreements on hazard criteria in the annexes, and maybe we can bring something like that in, so that we can present some sort of criteria against which products can be measured, if you like, so that it almost provides a tool for countries to either ban products from their market, or provide or put a higher tax on it, for instance, or put some sort of EPR scheme based on these criteria. If these criteria are included in the agreement, it could be equated to an international standard, in which case they may be able to bypass any WTO issues on trade. So I would like to see an agreement that allows countries to put those economic and regulatory instruments in place that will really push back on industry to change the design of the product, but also enable some sustained financing of waste management in the domestic context. And I think that's an area where a multilateral fund can help assist countries to do some of the assessments, the socioeconomic assessments on those instruments, but also then plan the policies and the regulatory frameworks within their context in the country, and then provide some sort of seed funding, etc., for perhaps a container deposit scheme or whatever they're wanting to implement. So I think this agreement should promote that domestic ownership of waste management, but also those funding mechanisms for waste management that also then push back up on design, so that there is a value for the product at the end of life. And I think if we can get that right in this agreement, I think we're doing pretty well. Thanks.
And uphill task for sure. Trying to bring all countries on board for that. So that's going to be interesting to watch. Professor Chaudhary.
This is really interesting for me to know about different treaty system. I'm not very aware of it. But one thing in science, we always used to say in environmental science that something is better than nothing. I mean, there are a lot of problems in environment happening everywhere. Climate change problem is there, pollution issue is there. So every time scientists and technologists try to make something a little better than the last one. So now we're trying to see that the pollution became a little less from something. So with that positiveness in mind, I will always say that whatever we are trying to do to have a treaty to stop the plastic from flowing freely in the oceans and destroying our ecosystem, and something a very unmanageable problem, whatever we are stepping up, it is itself is a very positive step. So this something can definitely be a lot of things when in future many of the countries, I really believe, will go and share the same concerns and sign up, and something better will happen. So we have seen it happening with other treaties. I'm very limited knowledge of that, but yes, the Montreal Protocol, different other treaties that have happened, some good thing has come out of it. So I'm pretty sure that over the period going to have some kind of betterment for this particular problem, the plastic pollution, production of recyclable plastic, forcing some of the companies and some farms to actually be more sustainable, produce something that is more sustainable, it will definitely going to make a change. That is my views on this.
Dr. Preston, we still have you with us. What are your views on this?
Well, I had some familiarity with the Convention on Biological Diversity and the climate change framework. I mean, what I've noticed with the CBD is that countries do put in their reports, but unless anybody reads them, and I was reading them, what happens then? I mean, countries put them in. I looked at Australia's, and it really wasn't very robust. But unless another country calls it out and says, well, you know, you're lining up all these sort of actions, it just sits in the box and nothing happens. So in a sense, you need some UN committee that reads the reports and actually follows up with countries. So that's the first thing that can be useful if somebody's actually tracking what's happened. And there's another body called Climate Action Tracker that assesses sort of performance under the UNFCCC. So that is very useful. I've used that. I don't know if anybody knows it or has a look at it. It really just assesses each country's national plan and performance and various statistics. So having that sort of facility in relation to plastics, tracking what's happening, seeing if what countries say they're doing is actually happening on the ground is another thing. And I also just put a comment on I find in the area that I'm interested in, which is Indigenous rights and the environment and human rights, is looking at various UN special rapporteurs. I mean, they're very, very useful, particularly ones on human rights, environment, and this space. The UN special rapporteur on toxics is also monitoring what's going on and in relation to vulnerable groups. So it's not only what's happening with the treaty, but also other bodies, either official bodies from UN or other ones that are working just to track the performance and the implementation on the ground, especially for Indigenous, local and minority communities, which I think really needs to be in this conversation. I mean, that's the problem with many conventions, that they're just left out of the convention, left out of the negotiating, left out of the implementation. So I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that, but I would really love to advocate for that to be a very important part of it. Thank you.
Yeah. That's an important point, and that tends to be an important sort of major gap again at the international level. Dr. Robbenheimer, Dr. Rose. This is an important issue, so we take a couple of minutes to discuss it.
I have a lot of respect for Professor Marcus Oriana, who is the current special rapporteur on toxics, but not a great deal of respect for the processes under the UN Human Rights Council, which appoints the rapporteurs. So given the dysfunctionality within the Human Rights Council, I don't think there's a great deal that can be expected out of that process that's going to be of specific benefit in the plastics sphere. So I'm a skeptic of the UN Human Rights Council, which is widely regarded as one of the more dysfunctional corners of UN governance. So with that negative aspersion, I'll pass the microphone on, because I am aware that there is a language that's being used that calls for impacts on minorities and participation of minorities to be assured in the new regime.
If I could just put one more comment, and I've actually got to go, but I would say the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, David Boyd, and the previous one, John Knox, they are actually extremely active, and they're actually helping a group from Torres Strait Islands to make a complaint to the UN Human Rights Committee. So they're kind of across the whole space, so the sort of holistic approach to many issues. And often UN Special Rapporteurs work together from different disciplines. So there's a burgeoning sort of group of different specialities, but, you know, if there's a common element, they tend to work together and report and represent and do amicus briefs. And so that's a really, really important area that I have actually tried to encourage people to look into this space and sort of really use that tool, if you like, because it's very important. I know it sort of sits outside what you were talking about, but in a sense, it informs and is very important in terms of advocacy and action.
Mm.
So with that in mind, I will have to take my leave, and thank you very much. I found it very, very interesting, and thank you, Associate Professor Mehta. It's been a great webinar. So
yeah, thank you very much for joining us. It was great having you. Thank you for taking the time.
All right. I'll see you all later.
So, I think that the sort of key point that comes out from this discussion is that it's important to have, as a part of this drafting process, it's important to have as many key stakeholders being a part of the drafting, the negotiations, and so on. You know, NGOs, indigenous communities, minority communities, of course, representatives from developing countries, but not just government, you know, civil society and so on. So that will, and particularly with a problem such as plastic, which is, you know, it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere. It's impacting particularly people from minority communities, disadvantaged communities, marginalized communities, you know, lower income coastal communities, for instance. So their voices need to be heard in the solutions that come forward in, you know, the drafting of the treaty, in the any further instruments that will come out after that, and any sort of, you know, further national action plans, other action plans, etc. Somehow their involvement in this process is important. Plus, also the treaty needs to and should, and hopefully it is going to be adopting this more and more, a human rights approach in order to actually, you know, truly achieve its goals. Because as we know, plastic pollution has a considerable impact on a number of human rights: the right to life, right to health, right to a healthy environment. So the human rights approach needs to be a part of that. And of course, then that links in with all these communities whose voices need to be heard as well. So a long way to go, as Dr. Robbenheimer pointed out, a lot of difficult discussions to have and less time to have it. But one hopes that the gravity of the problem will push governments and their representatives to negotiate in good faith and, you know, with complete transparency, and trying to actually find effective solutions to the problem of plastic pollution, and also bring private sector on board, that we have their cooperation. So a lot to be done. In line with this, I've received one question from one of our viewers on YouTube. So this is a young student, and he says that you know, this is great. You know, there's a lot of it's very inspiring that there is this international treaty being drafted. You know, in one sense, it gives hope, but on the other hand, we've had all these treaties which haven't worked, and it seems, you know, like an uphill task. It seems like it's going to take a lot of time. There's going to have to be, let's say, a framework treaty. Then there's going to be further, you know, protocols or instruments. Some countries will be parties, some will not be party. I mean, all that will keep happening. So this could take a long time. You know, so by the time we actually solve the problem of plastic pollution, we may be, you know, dealing with much larger volumes of plastic pollution already than what we're already dealing. So this seems like, you know, a really, really uphill battle. So what can we do now? You know, as a young person, or, you know, as any of us, what can we do now? What are the immediate things that can be done, immediate initiatives to try to stem the tide of plastic pollution? I'll ask all three panelists to share their views on this. Dr. Robbenheimer, start, Professor Chaudhary, then Dr. Rose.
Thank you. So from a personal level, I think a lot of our issues, not just in plastics, is our overconsumption. So as a consumer, if we can reduce our consumption of plastics, but also everything else, because most of it comes packaged in plastic, that's one way to really start protecting our environment and helping our environment, and reducing that extraction from the environment. So for me, consumption broadly is our problem. but particularly around plastics. When it comes to the agreement, I think just going back to some of the multi-stakeholder participation that you were talking about, there are multi-stakeholder dialogues that are happening. There was one just before the open-ended working group in Dakar. The resolution also calls for a multi-stakeholder action agenda. So there are groups there from the waste pickers that were represented at the meetings. There's also those representing chemicals and the harm to humans, particularly, such as IPEN. So, if you really want to get involved, you could find out which of those NGOs are represented and accredited and try and be involved in that if you wanted to help with the agreement as well. Thanks.
Professor Chaudhary.
Well, my comment will be the same. I mean, there is a lot to be done from a scientific and technological standpoint. If I see that, definitely looking forward towards a kind of model that is implementable and sustainable would be the one goal. But it also turns into the economic systems. So sadly, as most of the things are, when we try to deal with any problem in environment, how to make use of plastic less cheap. Now it is very cheap. So if somehow it can be made less cheaper, definitely economic incentive of using it also would going to go down. So I agree with Professor Karen here that most of the problem is with the consuming, because the consumers for these plastic products are really high, and they are dissuading people to not to use it and go for alternative. First have to have an alternative at place that is at par with the plastics in terms of economic and usability. So that needs innovation and research and funding for the scientists who are actually working in this field. So that should be a part of the treaty system, definitely. And on other way around, I will also say that it is a very positive step. I mean, some step is being taken to bringing plastic pollution in the forefront. We know these things are not easy. There will be a lot of hardships that will come on the way, but definitely with multiple stakeholders coming into the place and definitely different disciplines working together, human rights, scientists, law enforcers and lawmakers, international implementers, definitely this can be a successful in the future. I have great hopes of that. Thank you.
Professor Rose.
I suppose that there are two levels at which one can act. One is the personal, in terms of personal consumption. And so that involves using a reusable coffee cup and shopping bags and so on. And the other is agitating for change. And I think that accessible points of influence are available to students. For example, an environmental club on campus that has a focus on plastics can approach the local Chamber of Commerce and say that we're concerned about this and we would like to see local industry take steps, and just gently pressure in locally available points of influence in order to push others to change where they have the capacity to make change.
Dr. Oppenheimer.
Yeah, I'd just like to add another dimension to this, and that's the information. We know there's a big lack of information in some areas, but more broadly, we need a lot more. And I think there's areas for everyone to assist in collecting that information. There are NGOs, there's scientists, there's all sorts, who can help us track what's in the environment. So that sort of data is needed, baselines plus sort of trends in the growth of any plastics in the environment, but then also the material flows, so waste flows, etc. So there's a lot of information that can be gathered, and I think everyone can assist, find groups that are working on that to provide that information. Thank you.
Yeah, I think what you've just said, and Dr. Rose's suggestion earlier, it links with the next question I got, which is again another young person who's asking that, as a young person, what can I do? So what can I actually do on a daily basis? Consumption is one thing, but what else can I do? on a daily basis. So I'll put this to all the panelists.
Well, there's a big responsibility in sorting at the source. So if you do have to buy plastics, a large part of it is reducing that contamination and sorting so that it gets to the right place and it's cheaper to recycle. So find out what those systems are near you and around you and try and promote that amongst your friends and your family.
Actually, Karen, there's the important lesson that you taught me, which is that one should always take the lid off the container because the lid is made out of a different plastic to the container itself, so that at least they're separated as well. That's something that I've done ever since you told me about that.
Okay, my suggestions will be like, let's start everything at from the home. I mean, there are a lot of plastic pollution, mismanagement of waste that happen in our vicinity. As a young person, I can start from there, like to segregate the waste up and start and help with the recycling process. So definitely the plastic waste should not be there in my campus. That is why I should start, but definitely over the period of time, this particular thing will grow up. And as a young person, it can start from the home, how to change the habits, because if the consumer demand for the plastic goes down, definitely the importance of the product will definitely go down.
Go down, yeah. Plus, of course, all the students out there who are studying different courses, whether it be law, whether it be science, you can go, as you graduate, you can become environmental lawyers, you can take part in the policy making processes, you can be the innovators and the scientists that we need to develop these new products, and as Dr. Oppenheimer said, and Dr. Rose, that, when we're talking about future proofing, this convention and this treaty that's going to come out, so future proofing means that there's going to be continuous innovation that is going to be needed over the next coming decades. So there's a lot that young people can do on a daily basis. Plus, as people who are working in the environmental sector want to work in the environmental sector, and going forward. And there's a need for more and more young people in this space, wanting to work in this space. And young people can also perhaps take part in the negotiating processes. They can, through their governments, through NGOs, etc., they can play a role in that and get their voices heard. Dr. Oppenheimer?
Thanks. You just made me think about the career path. And it's not just about designing new products and new materials. There's a lot of innovation happening in the waste management sector. It's highly computerized. So if you're in IT, it's an area to go into. If you're an engineer, it's an area to go into. There's transport issues. There's logistics issues. So I think you could probably take just about any career and you can find something in the plastics world that you can do.
Exactly. And this is, I guess, an unfortunate thing, but on the other hand, there's a lot to do, but it's unfortunate that this sort of huge environmental mess has been landed on the young people, whether it be climate change, whether it be plastic pollution. So in a sense, whatever, efforts are being made, whether it be treaties, whether it be other efforts, at the end of the day, it's going to be the youth who are going to take things forward and who are actually going to make the change needed. So there's, it's basically, at the end of the day, it's going to be all on the youth. That's the way I see it. That's the way the climate change movement has moved forward. And that's the way any of these problems that we're trying to control is going to move forward. We have another question from a science enthusiast. So this will go to Professor Chaudhary. He's asking that one of the problems with sustainable bioplastics is that feedstocks may compete with growing food, like biofuels. So how do we deal with this issue, Professor Chaudhary?
So before we go to that, there are other problems I'll just give as an example. For example, in order to produce biodiesel, a lot of the lands in different parts of the globe, which is very near to the rainforest, which is the main carbon sink, is getting transferred into producing this fuel. So yes, whenever we give this kind of solution, it definitely has something to do with changing, somehow impacting the environment. And later, we being a scientist try to think that what is the better option? I mean, it is less bad than before it is, or is it worse? So definitely when we are going to say that we need bioplastics and some material from from crops need to be there, and it become profitable. It can, in certain parts, can replace the food crop system, but we also have to understand that food crop system is also evolving. Agricultural science is also evolving over the period of time. What a particular hectare of land used to produce maybe 50 years back, it's not exactly the produce now, because now there are a lot of innovations that come up. Now, we can always debate whether these innovations are very environment friendly or not. My answer will be no, not always. But again, I will come to that one specific point. Something is better than nothing. So yes, there would be problems. But if we think in a right directions, we will definitely going to find out some way how to manage this problem also in a sustainable world. The idea should be sustainability. So any process should be sustainable. Sometimes it do clash with different kind of system, and yes, definitely there is a possibility, like in the case of biodiesel, many of the agricultural farmlands will be transferred into producing biofuels or producing biodegradable products. But there would be some alternative to that. Now, the present problem is the plastic, how to deal with it. So we should start this journey. Over the journey, everybody learns. That's one of the very basic concept of science. We learn every day. So when the problems will come up, eventually, surely some solution is also going to come up on the way. That's my suggestion on this. Yeah.
I just wanted to raise something there as well around the agricultural lands being used to produce biodiesel, bioplastics. Agriculture uses a lot of plastic in itself. Agri-plastics are a huge contributor to plastic waste. A lot of it is contaminated, can't be recycled efficiently or economically. So, we have PVC piping for irrigation, we have mulch plastics, we have tree guards, we have the packaging of the product. So it's not just the land use that's the problem, it's the actual plastics that go into producing the bioplastic, which hopefully could be biodegradable in themselves. But yeah, so not to forget agri-plastics.
Yeah, so this kind of again links with another question that has just come from a YouTube viewer, that so alternatives to plastics. Again, how do we? What are the best alternatives? So they're asking, could jute be a more sort of immediate alternative, or what other alternatives are there presently, and what is the innovation that needs to be done more to find alternatives to plastic, considering the different types of plastic and the different types of uses of plastic. I think Professor Chaudhary, you can come in here, and the other panelists, and then Dr. Rose.
So new innovations are coming up. As far as my knowledge goes, that different lab groups are working in different parts of the world in order to find out some alternative. They're working on different dimensions. I mean, either some idea is how to reduce the consumer part of the plastic. If the plastic is not used that much, it will not pollute that much. The concept is on that ground. On other way around, also there is a scientific different group that are trying to find out alternative to this plastic. So if plastic is phased out, what else? What can replace it? So that should be another issue, another very important innovation that need to be taken care of. In case of energy, we can say directly that if the energy system, for example, I'm giving that if we want to reduce the emission of carbon dioxide, which is one of the great problem of climate change, the alternative should be going towards renewable. But in case of plastic, this particular answer is very obscure right now. But that don't mean that it will be obscure after some 10 years or 20 years down the line, because research is going on that direction also. And another way that Dr. Cairns also mentioned, that plastic is generated from almost every facet of our life, starting from agriculture, from healthcare system. I remember, just for example, a few months back, I was reviewing one of the papers for a journal, and they have talked about what to do with different kind of plastic that coming out to contain COVID, like face masks, different kind of plastic, what to do with them. They are increasing in healthcare system a lot, how to manage them. So there is one scientific group who is trying to see what to do and how COVID is impacting the plastic production system. So it has root in every part of our life. So definitely it needs to be taken care of to be more sustainable. It cannot happen overnight. Innovations don't happen overnight. Plastic hasn't come overnight. It has taken a lot of time for the people to think that what to do with this useless chemical, and later it turned out into plastic, which is the talk of the day during those time, maybe 100 years, 50 years, 60 years back the line. Now we can understand it is totally not good for the environment. So yes, innovations will come up on the way. Fundings is required for that. And possibly one of the greatest funders are the industries, and obviously the energy industries may not be that much interested to fund to find alternative that can reduce their profit share. So yes, something needs to be done on the global scale also. Maybe through the treaties, some funding needs to be given in order to produce different kind of scientific research, so that something good come out that can phase out plastic away. That should be the something long time in future. This could be the model.
Dr. Rose.
This is not a comment, but a question again, and one that I direct to Dr. Oppenheimer and Professor Chaudhary. And it goes back to the idea of design criteria for plastics to ensure recyclability or biodegradability. And the question is, would the notion of plastic biodegradability be an oxymoron, a nonsense? Because my understanding is that currently what is treated as biodegradable plastic is just mixed with cornstarch, so that we're only producing microplastics. We're not actually, we don't actually have biodegradable plastics. We just have breakable bags, but the polymers continue as microplastics in the soil or wherever they end up. Is that correct?
To certain sense, yes, Professor Rose. I mean, I believe that the innovation in terms of like phasing out plastic, that's why I mentioned that in case of energy, whenever we say we have to phase out greenhouse gas emitting industries, we can say, okay, in the energy companies can be renewable. But in case of plastic, we cannot say that, because that innovation needs to be there. Whatever alternative we are coming, sadly, we actually find a very good alternative long time back, and that is plastic. Now, replacing the plastic with another very good alternative is difficult, but not impossible, that we have seen in technology. There are always option out, but more research needs to be done on that. And definitely, as of now, the research is going in the right direction, but the result may not come overnight. But yes, definitely over the period of time, we may find some good alternative to that. And then carrying out that what we used to do when plastics were not there. That question, this answer itself can also put us into a nice direction, what could be done to phase out plastic. So it is my way of seeing this thing. So definitely research needs to go on. As of now, everything, whatever there is a word plastic to it, it can turn into microplastic, and invariably in different ways can impact the environment. We may not see it getting deposited in our backyard or in a landfill, but definitely it will be in the environment, because polymers is very difficult to degrade. But some innovation need to be there in order to do that.
Yeah, I might just add to that. I mean, making a product biodegradable is a difficult thing because of the different conditions that it might have to operate under. For instance, if it's in the Pacific, in a humid country on the shelves, it's probably not going to last very long. Also, if it gets into different types of soil, whether it's clay or dry soil or sandy soil, it's going to degrade at different levels. If it gets into the ocean, it still has opportunity to entangle and be ingested before it biodegrades. So we've really spoken about the technical solutions here, but I like to differentiate between the technical solutions and the social solutions. So technical, yes, we've discussed those, but social, we can break that down into firstly asking if we actually need that product at all. Yes, there's some parts of the community that need a straw, for instance, but do we actually need a straw, be it a metal straw, which has its own environmental impact, or a plastic straw? Do we need this product at all is the question we should be asking ourselves first. So that's the first social solution. The second one is looking at alternate business models. Is there another way of doing this? For instance, car tires. Do we need as many cars on the road? Can we catch a tram, etc.? So are there other business models such as reuse and other things that we can do? So I like to approach it from the social solutions first, and then you really narrow down to the products that we actually still need, and are there then technical solutions to solve that?
With the problem as complex as plastic pollution, and one which again is sort of a product that has become such an integral part of our life, without the social solution, without people wanting to change, without that kind of large scale change taking place, it's not going to be possible. No matter how many treaties and laws we put in place, it's not going to be possible to actually phase out the use of plastic. So that's going to be extremely important. And that's also the challenge, whether it be climate change, whether it be biodiversity loss, whether it be plastic pollution. And that's, of course, also where young people come in, because they, I believe, have the power to, convince people around them, whether it be the elders around them, their parents, the older generations, their fellow students, colleagues, etc. I firmly believe in the power of the youth in bringing about this kind of change, because clearly our generations have not done a very good job. So it's going to lie a lot on the way in which the youth respond to this problem and to the solutions. Of course, the solutions need to be also conveyed, and there need to be, as you said, different business models. Those business models need to be made attractive to people. So all that needs to be done as well. So you need the government, you need government-private partnerships, all that. And then you need, of course, the people and the young people working on this and ensuring that these solutions are implemented. Yeah, Dr. Oppenheimer.
Yeah, I think one really simple option all of us can do is to go and visit a landfill. If you go and see what's in that landfill, you really look at that waste and it looks awful and you feel sick to your stomach, but you look at the items there and you go, I used one of those yesterday and I did that and I did that. And if you don't see some relation between your consumption and what's in that landfill, then I don't know, there's much hope for you in trying to fix the problem. But to me, go and visit a landfill, take everyone with you and make it an outing and have a look at where you don't want your waste to go.
Yeah, no, and that's so true, actually. I mean, if we actually create more emotional sort of linkages with any of these problems, we would be moving towards solutions faster. So as lawyers, of course, all of us think as lawyers and legally, but that is one of the issues with climate change. That's one of the reasons why the level of changes that have to be made aren't being made, that somewhere there's a disconnect, because it's such a huge problem, that there's a disconnect between this can actually happen to me, this can impact me, this will impact me now, so I need to do something about this. So that emotional connect needs to be done. So unfortunately, we've more or less run out of time, and we could have gone on for another hour, I think. But the discussion has shed light on a number of key aspects. It's given hope, I think, to a lot of us, because, of course, the fact that there is this international effort being made to draft a treaty is in itself noteworthy itself. It gives hope, because it means that at least governments are realizing the scale of the problems there, agreeing to come together. That itself is a major, it's a big thing. What is needed now, of course, is to sort of not lose that momentum and build on that momentum to have something concrete steps coming out in the drafting of the treaty and what happens after that, and in the translation of those legal measures at the national level, at the regional level, in the reporting, in compliance, and then in the involvement of civil society and private sector and companies and the oil and gas companies and all these big giants as well, in the efforts to actually phasing out plastics and controlling plastic pollution. So that's going to be the next big challenge, so that this actually leads to an effective legal endeavor, rather than another treaty that we're going to be monitoring with not very happy results, as has happened with the climate change treaty. So that's something which we need to learn from. And but from as an educator and from my experience with young people, I again want to conclude with the point that now there's more and more awareness among young people. So with greater involvement of young people in the treaty drafting itself, perhaps in the consultations that take place, and also, of course, of the scientific community, the NGO community, having greater involvement of civil society from the start, so there's greater ownership of this process and of this phasing out of plastics. There is a possibility for this to actually be something that is going to be effective. So with that, I want to thank all the panelists for taking their time out and dealing with this extremely challenging issue and giving hope along the way, and raising a lot of key points, which I hope are going to be a part of the drafting as well as the treaty negotiations go forward. Thank you very much for that. And I'll hand the floor to Mehek and DP, who are the two LSAF student representatives, to give their vote of thanks.
Thank you, Professor Mehta. Just to add to Professor's Robbenheimer point, I feel I did visit landfill this summer, and I think it was so overwhelming to see the vast amount of waste present there. And as already mentioned, I feel every single one of us should at least visit a landfill at least once in their lifetime. And I think that being said, I feel it was indeed an incredibly informative and enlightening webinar. A lot of key takeaways for sure, and a very powerful perspective on the current plastic crisis. I extend my gratitude to everyone present here to take our time to grace the event. A special thanks to Professor Karen Robbenheimer. We are grateful for the time and effort you took to share your thoughts and experiences. A special thanks to Professor Gregory Rose for your valuable insights. We're grateful to Professor Abhinav Chaudhary for giving an excellent coverage of the scientific complexities of the topic. Professor Judith Weston, thank you for the inspiring opening remarks and all those inspiring remarks that you made throughout the session. I extend my gratitude to Professor Tarani Mehta to wonderfully moderate the webinar in the best way possible. I would also like to express my thanks to the IT team for helping us with all the technicalities. Lastly, I remain most grateful to the audience for joining us today and for their amazing questions. I hope you took away a lot of insightful points as much as we did. Thank you all for joining us. Have a good one.
Thank you.